Hi, I'm Shauna Gordon-McKeon, and welcome to my pre-recorded talk on the governance challenges of open source projects. We're going to cover a few different things today in this short talk. We're going to cover the basics of governance, what it is and why we should care about it. We'll talk about some specific challenges, governance challenges that open source projects face. And we'll also talk about some next steps that you can take if you're interested in learning more about governance. The link to the slides that I'm sharing with you now is at this link here. There's also a QR code if you prefer to get the slides that way. So let's jump into the basics. What is governance and why should we care about it? So governance is about more than just who is in charge. It includes things like conflict resolution, project road mapping, and even things like how you onboard new community members. One framework I find really helpful for thinking about governance is Elinor Ostrom's 3 levels of governance. Ostrom was a Nobel Prize-winning economist who studied commons governance, and if you get at all involved in the open source governance world, you will hear her referenced a lot. The insight of hers that I want to talk about today is the 3 levels of governance, which are constitutional, collective, and operational. Collective is what most people commonly think of as governance, i.e. who's in charge, but the constitutional and operational levels are just as important. The constitutional level I like to think of it as who decides who decides. And a great example of this, of constitution level decision-making, is from Python itself. Back in 2018, when Guido van Rossum stepped down as BDFL, he didn't appoint a successor or say, I think things should be more democratic now, so here's how you're going to do it. Instead, he said to the core developers, you decide. Which, okay, technically does answer the question of who decides, but it didn't say how. And so the core developers spent many months debating about how they should go about deciding until they found a process that everyone agreed was legitimate. To learn more about this, you can see my 2019 PyCon talk about the Python governance transition. It's linked at the end of the slides. Another example is the drafting of the United States Constitution, which happened at the the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which, by the way, didn't have any authority to write a new constitution. They were supposed to just be amending the Articles of Confederation, but they decided to throw them out and make an entirely new constitution, which goes to show that at the constitutional level, which is the sort of highest level of governance, it's less about what's technically legitimate and more about what enough people will accept as legitimate. If enough people think that the system as a whole just isn't working, they can throw it out and start again from scratch, like they did with the Articles of Confederation. On the other side of things is the operational level of governance, which is the sort of day-to-day. How do people actually make decisions in the community? How do they exercise their power? In the case of an open source software project, we might ask, who has a commit bit for the repository? Who has the keys to the server? Who can kick people off from mailing lists or moderate their posts? And these are just the formal software mediated permissions. We can also ask things like, who has social influence in the community? Who do other people respond to? Who's doing work that others rely on? Unlike the constitutional level of governance, which may only come up every few years, questions of operational governance come up constantly, and it's the level of governance we have the most practice with. But some people don't think of it as governance at all, which is a shame because I think this lens offers us a different and potentially quite productive way of understanding these day-to-day challenges. Projects might have trouble finding enough contributors or deciding which tasks to work on, or they might just have like a generally grumpy vibe in their social spaces and think, this isn't ideal, but they won't necessarily think to view it through a governance lens. And I hope that's something that we can change. Perhaps the biggest hesitation that I've heard from people about embracing or even exploring governance is the worry that this will make their projects really bureaucratic. And this is a valid concern. I am obviously fascinated with governance, but I too hate long, boring meetings where nothing gets accomplished. So I don't know the secret sauce that lets you avoid all pointless meetings forever, but I do have some advice for avoiding frustrating bureaucracy. The first is to recognize that not every decision needs a process. The more important a decision is, the more likely you are to want a process for it, because processes can make sure that conflicts are surfaced and that all voices are heard and that feedback is gathered. But most decisions are just not that important, and so you don't need a process for them. The second is that you can make a process your backup instead of your default. A couple of orgs that I'm part of operate by loose consensus, which means that as long as no one blocks a decision, the person who proposed it can go forward with it. But if the proposal is blocked, then there's a period of discussion and a vote. But that's only triggered if there's actually a disagreement, when it's needed. The third thing is that processes can be tentative. You can try something and say, if enough people say this isn't working, we'll go back to the drawing board. You can even sunset a process. So this would be saying, we're going to do a steering council for 6 months, and at the end of it, we're going to stop it, and then we'll reflect on it. But we're not going to just keep it going because no one wants to say that it's not working. Finally, I'll note that while bad processes often slow things down, well-designed processes can speed things up. Good processes help people communicate quickly and effectively, and these processes can also serve as a form of record keeping, making the history and structure of the project more transparent and accessible. So, okay, that's a general introduction to governance as it applies to open source projects. And now I want to move on to the next section where we're going to talk about a few specific challenges that projects face. So there are many different types of governance challenges. I can't possibly talk about them all. So I'm just going to talk about the first 3 on this list. And the first one is figuring out what your governance even is. Many projects start on one person's whim and gain momentum and people in a haphazard sort of way. Then for some reason, they're called on to define their governance, maybe because a funder requires it, or maybe because they're tired of people asking how decisions are made. Or let's go ahead and use a fictional example here. Let's say we've got a woman, Clara, who's the founder of a Python project called PyPuppies, an app for dog shelters. She's seen other projects wither away because the maintainer burned out. By the time those maintainers realized they were burned out, they had no energy to figure out who should take the project over. Clara has decided that that is not going to be her, and her first step is figuring out how the PyPuppies governance currently works. Clara decides to fill out a questionnaire that asks questions like, who can review pull requests and triage issues? Who actually does the reviews and triaging? Who do people defer to in the community? Who is trusted? By answering these questions, she comes up with a small list of active community members and the roles they hold. For instance, there are 2 other maintainers with merge rights, Vinay and Maria, although only Vinay actually seems to merge things. There's also Jacob, who doesn't use GitHub, but is super helpful answering questions on IRC. Clara realizes that although they have no formal role, she would never make a major decision without first talking to Vinay, Maria, and Jacob. Now that she feels like she better understands her community's existing structure, she spends some time browsing through examples of open source governance models and finds one that describes the model of a BDFL with an advisory council. She shares this example with Vinay, Maria, and Jacob. They hadn't really thought of themselves as an advisory council, but they're flattered and excited by the idea of joining one, even if it's mostly just a new way of talking about what they were already doing. Clara writes up their governance in a governance.md document and adds it to the repository. Now, if anybody asks, she can point them there. And that's the story of how Clara and PyPuppies tackled the Make Your Governance Explicit challenge. Now, I think making your governance explicit is valuable in and of itself. You can stop there. You don't have to do it as part of a process with some other challenges. But let's keep going with our fictional example. So the next example I want to talk about is cultivating community leadership. So some projects can continue indefinitely with a single maintainer, and that's fine. But sometimes projects really do need more leaders. And signs of this can include the maintainer starting to feel burned out and like there's too much for them to do, all actions and decisions having to go through the maintainer, even when they don't need to, and members of the community that want to help but aren't sure how. In our PyPuppies example, Clara isn't feeling burned out yet because she's trying to stay ahead of the game. But she does think that some of the decisions she's making could be trusted to Vinay or Maria or Jacob. And there are a few people she recognizes from the IRC channel who've been around for a while who might want to get involved if only they knew how. In my experience, there's a few different issues as to why people don't step into leadership roles. Some are hard for maintainers to address, like maybe people just aren't interested or they're not available, or they need constant compensation and funding that the project doesn't have. But there are 2 major things that maintainers can address. One is when potential leaders don't have the context that they need to lead well. And another is when they do have the context, but they don't feel empowered to lead. Clara decides to tackle problem B first. She knows that Maria has enough context about the project to be trusted to merge things. Maria is constantly leaving helpful and insightful comments on pull request reviews, but she never actually merges anything. Clara has a call with Maria, who said she's never had merge rights to a repository before and she's afraid to mess up. Clara tells her, I wouldn't give you merge rights if I didn't think you could handle them. And if you make a mistake, that's fine. I make mistakes too. We can just revert the PR. Maria still seems hesitant, but she starts merging things occasionally. Clara also has a conversation with Jacob. She thanks him for all the work he does helping people in IRC. She asks him if he's noticed people that seem like they'd want to get more involved, and Jacob identifies several. These people don't have a lot of project context like Clara and Jacob do, So they need to help them get more context by doing context building tasks. These are tasks that don't require a lot of pre-existing context, but expose the person to new context. So in that sense, it's context building. Examples include triage teams, pull request review, writing up release summaries, doing summaries of community activities, helping with some kinds of documentation updates, and doing user research. Clara and Jacob decide to start up a triage team. They train the new contributors on how their labeling system works and what kind of information they need to check issues to make sure they have. They also start inviting new contributors to do pull request reviews. They create a guide for how to review PRs. This not only helps the new contributors, it also helps Maria be more confident when merging PRs because she can check them against the guide first. While many of the people who join the triage team and the PR review team drop out, many others stick around and gain lots of knowledge about the project. Some become regular contributors, and 2 of them even join the advisory council. Challenge 3, transitioning to a new governance structure. The final challenge I want to talk about today is what it looks like when a project wants to transition from one structure to another. There's a lot of different variables that affect this, a lot of situational factors. We can't possibly cover all of them. However, one thing that makes the process much, much easier is when everyone agrees on who is making the decision, and ideally also how the decision is being made. In the case of Python, Guido told the core developers that it was their job to make the decision. They had to figure out how to do it, but at least they knew who was deciding. In our PyPuppies example, Clara has done the work to make her project's governance explicit and to cultivate community leaders. She has 5 members in her advisory council who she can turn to help her transition the governance. Together, she and the council talk through what they want in the new governance model, what values they want to preserve, like transparency and friendliness, and what their fears are. One of their big fears is that the new governance model will be too disruptive. So they pick a model that makes use of the existing advisory council and turns it into a steering council. So there aren't that many changes. So these are just a few of the different governance challenges projects run into and a few of the different approaches that they might use to solve these challenges. Some next steps to wrap things up. I have created an open source repository framed around these governance challenges. My goal is to collect insights and stories, tools and processes, and other resources that have been found to help address these challenges so that projects can learn from each other. During the sprints, we'll be working on adding to the repository, and you are welcome to join us. Projects can also schedule a time to come talk about their governance challenges, including potentially working through some of these exercises. You can sign up for a time slot at the link in the slides. We're also going to have an open space on Saturday, April 22nd, time and room TBD, as this is a pre-recorded talk 2 weeks in advance, and you cannot get an open space that far in advance. So this is going to be a chance to have a more open and freewheeling discussion about governance challenges, whether that's specific issues you're facing or more general questions about how to support governance within the Python ecosystem and within open source at large. Finally, here are some links and resources that I've mentioned throughout the talk if folks want to learn more about them. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking more about open source governance with all of you.